Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Let me just see here. So today I'll just present a summarized version of my doctoral dissertation, work that I actually just defended less than a month ago on developing a taxonomy of climate change and health solution pathways. So when starting this work, climate change and health was quickly emerging as a global health priority, and greater strategic insight was needed. So what I found from engaging with global philanthropy was a need to invest in the enabling factors that can provoke innovation in climate change and health solutions. My committee members included Dr. Kari Nadeau, who led the Harvard Center for Climate, Health, and the Global Environment, Rick Segrist, and Dr. Peter Singer, who acted as WHO Special Advisor on Sustainable Development Goal implementation. So I'm hoping that this quick presentation will help set the stage for our panel discussion on indicators that will follow. So this was the guiding framework used for the project to provide a strong theoretical foundation. It comes from Stanford University. And it suggests that solution creators must be able to transition seamlessly between the concrete and the abstract dimensions of a complex problem to create sustained positive change rather than going straight from understanding to creation, which often will only result in simple incremental change. By concrete, it means having a robust understanding of the data, of the facts, and of the key stakeholders of the issue. And by abstract, it means having conceptual models and an awareness of patterns and principles that underpin the complexity of the challenge. So this framework applied to the context of climate change using practical insights from my community members and a research fellowship I completed with a global health organization guided the project. So based on this guidance, we sought to answer two questions. The first one was, what are the most prominent climate change and health pathways and their associated solutions? And how did these pathways impact the global burden of disease? So in other words, can we construct conceptual frameworks from the literature? And does the literature have the essential data and facts to support practice? The second question was, how are philanthropic organizations addressing the health impacts of climate change? And in other words, what are the real-world experiences of organizations on this issue from a strategic perspective? So first, to construct the solution pathways, a narrative review of the literature was conducted, focusing on systematic reviews and reports from prominent organizations. A pathway for this project referred to the interconnected series of events and factors that link climate change to individual and public health outcomes through a cause and effect relationship. So through this work, 7 high-level climate change and health pathways were identified and validated by experts and organizations along the way. They were vectors and pathogens, extreme heat, food insecurity, poor air quality, water insecurity, mental well-being, and health systems. So these pathways reflect the literature as well as global health priorities. So I won't go over in detail the pathways, but you can look at them on the poster presentation section of the conference app. So in reflection of creating these pathways, a key challenge was the lack of information on the burden of disease posed by climate change. Only one of the pathways had a current burden of disease quantified, and that was for poor air quality. And the current burden of disease quantified for that pathway varied widely in the literature. However, the majority of the pathways, so 5 out of 7 of the pathways developed, had future disease burden projections within the literature, but again, those disease burden projections varied widely. So the magnitude of climate change's influence on health outcomes is not well understood. This contributes to widespread confusion and debate on the issue. Climate change is political, and we shouldn't let that prevent us from doing the foundational science needed to practice effectively. So we were not only interested in the literature, but also practice. We wanted to understand how organizations were addressing the health impacts of climate change in their work. And so we decided to focus on philanthropy, both private and government-funded philanthropy. In total, 14 organizations were interviewed, and they are highlighted here on the right of the screen, between March and June of last year. Thematic analysis was then used with the interview data to identify common themes. So the first theme relates to organizational strategy. Overall, no organization had formal public strategies to help communicate about their work. There was also a lack of common scaffolding or ways of understanding climate change and health to support discussions between me and the people being interviewed. A second theme identified relates to organizational approach. So many organizations stated they were confused about climate change and health terminology. And in fact, that's what we heard this morning during the presentation from the Brazil Ministry of Health as well. As well, very few organizations describe their work according to climate change and health pathways. And one thing that did emerge was the need to have both horizontal and vertical organizational functions. So vertical functions to build expertise within the organization on climate change and health, and then horizontal functions to be able to embed that expertise within existing programs and services. The third theme was defining and evaluating success. So this was an area that organizations struggled with by far the most. This was a major challenge for them and a very difficult question for them to answer. I would follow up with a question on the use of existing Global Development Agenda goals and targets, and whether they could be used to help define and evaluate their climate change and health work. And many actually did say that they believe that they could be used and were probably being overlooked within their organizations. And then the very last theme here is on solutions. So one of the main aims of this project was to understand how organizations were tackling climate change and health solutions, thinking that solutions would be uncovered through the interview process. However, very few solutions were being communicated, or at least being communicated with confidence. So if we apply the findings against the guiding framework mentioned earlier, we can begin to understand why organizations aren't identifying or at least communicating solutions, at least in my interviews. Remember, the framework suggests that innovators must be able to transition seamlessly between the concrete and the abstract dimensions of a complex problem to create sustained positive change. We found that we don't have data on the current burden of disease for climate change, but that we can conceptually understand the impact of climate change on health using pathways. We also found that philanthropy are struggling to define and evaluate climate change and health success, but that we can use existing goals and targets, perhaps as an opportunity to leverage. So as a result, it's not surprising that solutions weren't readily emerging during my conversations. And all of this leads to the main finding, and that is that organizations must not only invest directly in climate change and health solutions, but also indirectly in the conditions that will enable innovation to occur. This means investing in an understanding of the current burden of disease from climate change and identifying climate change and health global goals and objectives. So we didn't stop there. We went on to develop a practice-oriented tool to support organizations based on the insights covered in this project. We decided to use the climate change and health solution pathways already constructed and include a metrics component for each pathway using Sustainable Development Goal targets. So SDG targets were chosen because they represent a global consensus among all countries on a system of indicators and targets associated with development, including protecting the planet and addressing climate change. We showed that existing global development agenda goals and targets can suffice to support efforts in defining and evaluating success according to the 7 pathways. But are these the right targets? And can we even develop targets if we don't know where we're starting from? So I'll stop here, but please check out the taxonomy and this work in greater detail in the virtual poster app, in the conference app. Thank you.